So I wanted to take a quick second and welcome folks to Political Science 322, which is Internal Conflict and Political Stability, which I'm going to just colloquially refer to as civil wars. Oftentimes when I sort of introduce the syllabus, I do a little bit of discussion about why this is a really important class. And I think I'll talk about that in a couple ways. So one of them is it's a really important class to me personally because this is sort of what drew me into the study of political science. This is what I did my dissertation on. This is why I wanted to become a political scientist, because I was interested in this sort of foundational question of why do societies tear each other apart? Why do neighbors turn against neighbors? Why do we see ethnic conflict sort of break out in some moments in time? But above and beyond sort of my own interest in this topic, it was a really big and is a really big important question in terms of security studies. So if we are looking at sort of the number of interstate wars involving two countries, in the last 30 years, we've got Russia invading Ukraine, which is ongoing. We've got the U.S. invasion of Iraq, maybe the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. We could count that as an interstate war. India and Pakistan have fought a couple times, and Russia attacked Georgia. But there's not much else beyond that in terms of two countries with sort of fully modern militaries fighting each other for any sort of protracted amount of time. But when we look at civil wars, there's a lot of them, and there seems to be more than there were in the past. And so for perspective, from the period 1945 to 1990, there were about 100 civil wars. In the period from 1990 to 2000, just a 10-year period, there were over 50. And while the pace has slowed down a little bit in the last 20 years, it still remains quite elevated relative to the Cold War. And I would even argue that most of the major security challenges that the United States has faced over the last 20, 30 years, and I think even when we think about great power politics, the vast majority of those kind of conflicts have civil wars at their core. So if we're thinking about U.S. efforts at counterterrorism in Afghanistan, that involved supporting one side in a civil war to topple the Taliban, and then fighting an insurgency to sort of hold the Taliban off for 2 decades before eventually sort of withdrawing, and then trying to figure out how to navigate this country that's still kind of in chaos. In Iraq, the U.S. invades in a conventional conflict, but very quickly it turns into a sectarian conflict between different religious and ethnic communities within Iraq, and ends up being an insurgency against the United States as it tries to support and transition to a new Iraqi government. When we look at the conflict in Ukraine right now with Russia's invasion, Russia didn't invade out of the blue. A big part of that invasion was prefaced by 5 or 6 years in which Russia had been fostering a civil war essentially in the eastern part of Ukraine to try to sort of break off or create a lever around sort of ethnic Russians in the Donbass region of Ukraine. So a lot of the sort of big picture security questions that the United States has had to deal with have civil wars at their core. This is not something that's going away. It's something that's going to remain a central part of great power politics and how countries interact. And there's some really interesting and important questions. And so over the course of this semester, we're going to tackle 4 or 5 big themes. One of those themes is going to be sort of just what are different kinds of violence. We'll talk about civil wars. We'll talk about ethnic conflict. We'll talk about insurgencies versus and counterinsurgency. We'll talk about coups. So we'll talk about sort of the various different ways that we see states kind of tearing themselves apart. We'll talk about why do people turn on their neighbors? Why do we see these conflicts sort of break out when they do? We'll talk a little bit about how to some of the decisions that go into how conflicts get fought, whether it comes down to recruiting or securing weapons or limiting the resources available to insurgents to help prevent them from being able to conduct effective military operations. So we'll talk about some of the I don't want to say logistical side of civil war, but maybe that's a stand-in for now. And we'll talk about the question about why do we see civilians be targeted. That's a question that I think is in some ways troubling and difficult to tackle. But I think it's a really important question. I think tells us a lot about civil wars and conflict and why these things are so horrific. And to give you a sense of scale, I mean, some of the civil wars that we've seen over the last 30 years have been just massive in scale. The Great Lakes conflicts, a series of interlocking civil wars that took place in sort of Central Africa in the 90s and 2000s, killed probably 6 million people. So the volume or the level of destruction from these conflicts can be as large as a significant great power war. And I think it's worth understanding why that violence plays out the way it does. And then finally, we'll spend some time talking about sort of what the international community can do about that. We'll talk about some of the pros and cons and factors to consider when it comes to intervention. We'll talk about mediation. We'll talk about post-conflict reconstruction and development, and try to get a sense of like, so this is a reoccurring problem. It's a big problem in the international system. What can actually be done about it, which is where we'll sort of end the course. Again, I'm really excited about this. We're going to cover a lot of ground. The way the course is set up, it's very much theoretical. So here's a series of theories, and we're going to try to engage with those theories. And I want to give a little bit more of a note about why I set this course up that way. I mean, for one thing, it's very difficult to do a hands-on course on civil wars. I don't even know what that would look like, and it certainly probably wouldn't be legal. But theory is also a tool that I use to kind of insulate myself from some of the awfulness of what we'll be tackling. And this course has been very hard for me to teach over the years. In fact, this is my first time in about 5 years, because when the Syrian civil war was at its peak, I couldn't go in front of students and explain the logic of why Assad was dropping barrel bombs on schools. I could explain it, I just didn't feel comfortable doing it. But theory is a way that we can kind of understand and work with some pretty awful stuff, and do so in a way that partially insulates us from what's actually happening. And this is something that happens all the time when people talk about nuclear weapons, that the scale of the destruction is just completely unimaginable. And so we talk about things like nuclear utilization theory and mutually assured destruction and counter value and counter force. And we come up with like vocabulary and language to kind of like insulate ourselves from the fact that we're saying like an entire city of people dies. We do something similar in studying civil wars, maybe not on the scale of nuclear war. But there are pros and cons to that. And I just want to kind of flag that I'm using theory in a way to distance myself, but I also try personally to remain very cognizant of the lives and the pain that come with these conflicts, and to kind of always keep that in the back of my mind is why this is an important topic to understand, to study, and to think about. That ended on a little bit more of a down note than I was expecting, but I'm looking forward to a really good semester. Like I said, these are interesting questions, and I'm excited to help explore them with you.